at St. John's Martini Bar for our happy hour story time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for this very special invitation. I do give talks, but this is very special to me to give a talk in my hometown. And so I actually was not born in Crystal River. However, I was born not far away. I was born in Clearwater, but my family always had a fishing cottage up here. So we would come up every weekend, most summers, and so I really spent that part of my youth here. And then in 1967, my dad decided, let's just move up to Crystal River. To be honest, I wasn't terribly happy about it because I was leaving all my friends from school in Clearwater, but the other part of it was they essentially bribed me, which ended up being very important. And what I mean by that is that there was one person who was very special in my life that set the trajectory for the rest of my life, and that was my grandma. And my grandma, she was this large, matronly Southern woman. She loved to fish with a cane pole. And so I had this little rowboat, and I would row this boat around with my grandma in the back fishing, and the boat kind of sat like that with my grandma in the back. And so I literally just rowed all over Crystal River when I was growing up. And then when she passed away, she left some money to my parents and said, buy Buddy a boat with a motor on it, which they did. And so that boat was a little 16-foot runabout, kind of like a Boston whaler, but just kind of a knockoff version. And that ended up changing my life because I spent all of my time out on and under the water. And I was always very, very curious about the wildlife and fish and so forth. But back then, there wasn't, back in the 60s, there was no one really around who could answer a lot of my questions. Can we try you want to just go? Okay, next slide. Go back one. So when we moved to Crystal River, that was our house. And I think some of you would recognize it. It was sort of the first house in what was called Springs of Paradise. Now the cottage we had was down the river. And back then there was when they did dredging and so forth in the river, all the silt would just go down the river and the river would turn to chocolate. And so I remember when they were dredging all these canals, and then like I said, when my father decided to retire and we moved up here, we moved on to one of those canals. Now just those of you who don't know, this is the river. This is the river going down to the Gulf, and this is going up to Christmas Island and Hunter Spring, and then these are the canals. And all of this wooded area, this hydric hammock, beautiful forest hydric hammock, is where Three Sisters is located, in this photograph right about here. So I was within snorkeling and swimming distance of Crystal River. So next slide. So I was spending all my time out on the water, and that was part of the bribe, was that, buddy, you're going to get a boat when you move there, which was very, very important. And back then, there was one dive shop in Crystal River, and it was called Aqua Pier, and it was just like right over here. And there was a guy named Tom McQuarrie who owned and ran that single dive shop. So he gave me a job for 50 cents an hour, working in that dive shop, but I could get free air fills and could go out diving anytime I wanted to. And so just to tell you another little story, I gave an interview and it was in the media, and of course Mr. McCrory passed away a number of years ago, and I got this email and it was from Tom McCrory, and I go, that is really strange. And I opened it up and it was Tom McCrory Jr., who I had not heard from since I was in high school. And he and I were dive buddies, and we dove all over Kings Bay. And as those of you who have been residents for that long a time, Crystal River was truly crystal. So he sent me this photograph of me that he had taken. I was probably about 13 or 14 years old. And this photograph was taken directly off of Pete's Pier. There's a little, this is actually Pete's Pier in the background. The new one, the old one was down the river, if those of you that have been here for a long time. So right off Kings Bay, Pete's Pier, there's a little spring. And actually it was about 25, 30 feet deep. And you can see how clear the water was back then. And that's the way that the whole bay was. It was truly very much like the Bahamas. And so, next slide. So I was out on the bay, out on Crystal River all the time, out fishing and snorkeling and diving. And then one of the times I was out there, or multiple times when I was out there, I saw this guy kind of in this weird little boat, and he would be standing up with an umbrella and a pair of binoculars, and I would see him in different places around the bay. And I couldn't really figure out what the heck this guy's doing, because he didn't have a fishing pole, he didn't have a beer can, so he obviously didn't belong there. And so finally I got enough courage to go talk to him, and as it turns out, he was a PhD candidate from Cornell University. So we struck up a friendship and a conversation, and I would go and talk to him every once in a while. And finally, he sort of figured it out, that if you look at that little boat with that little tiny outboard on it, it would take him like a couple of hours to get down the river. Well, it'd take me about 20 minutes in my boat. So he kind of decided, I don't necessarily want this young teen sidekick, but maybe it's worth it, because I'd get a personal guide, and I would get a boat with his dad's money to pay for the gas, and that could really help me out in my manatee research. So he was the first guy to ever really study manatees in the wild, and this is in 1967 and 1968. So I was just intrigued by what he was doing, and became his volunteer assistant. And it was absolutely wonderful for me, because he could answer a lot of my questions, and he also just broadened my horizons outside of Little Crystal River, which at that time was pretty much just a fishing hamlet. So for the 2 years that he did his PhD research, I pretty much tagged along and helped him with that work. And so between my grandma and his name is Daniel Hartman, his nickname is Woody, those two folks really had the most influence on what ended up being my lifelong direction and career. Next slide. So back in the 60s, Crystal River was what we'd like to call a manatee happy place. The water was very clear. There was an introduction of exotic vegetation called hydrilla and myriophyllum. Before that, like you see in this photograph in the bottom, that photograph was not taken in any spring. That was just taken out in the bay, of the manatees resting on this white sandy bottom with just these small stands of vegetation, and you can see how clear the water was. So it was a perfect place for him to do his research. And then with the introduction of that exotic vegetation that came in and moved in all over the bay, it really made a big difference, because it provided food for the manatees. And that's when we began to see an increase in their population. Before that, people didn't really come to see manatees here. They came to go diving in the spring, and people really didn't even know that they were here for the most part. Hartman, he came to Florida in the first place. His professor had given him a choice to study one of two things, feral pigs or manatees. So he showed up at that dive shop called Aqua Pier, and when he went in there, he saw all these old photographs, of black and white photographs along the walls. And he asked Tom McQuarrie, where did you take these? And he goes, yeah, every once in a while we see a manatee out there. And so based on seeing those photographs, he came back that following year. And that's really why he came to Crystal River. But before that, people would, like I said, would come to Crystal River to get checked out for their dive certifications and to come fishing. And next slide. So, like I said, I sort of took up company with Woody Hartman. I would spend every moment I could, weekends and afternoons, out there with him, helping him with his research. And also, I then began to develop an interest in underwater photography, also to help with his research. We could identify all the individual manatees, for the most part, by their scars where they had been hit by boats. So you all probably read now in terms of how many manatees are in this area. It's like 1,000. Back then we had just about 60 individuals identified. And so it wasn't that common to see them out here, and people weren't really sure why they were coming into Crystal River. Next slide. So now a little bit of some of the history back then is, as I said before, the water was very, very clear. And what Hartman learned was that manatees, the springs, and you all know this being from here now, the springs stay around 73 degrees, so when the Gulf temperature drops, and they come in here to stay warm. And then when they leave, Hartman thought, well, they go, just out in the Gulf or up in the Swanee River. Well, we've now discovered that the manatees from Crystal River during the summertime go all the way out to Mobile, Alabama, where they spend a lot of their time. We have a study going on in Cuba. We have now had at least 3 manatees from Florida show up in Cuba, one of which was from Crystal River. It was first sighted, well, actually when I was in Cuba, just to tell you another story, where I had a student that was working. She told me about a mother and a calf that had shown up in a power plant. She went out and took some photographs of these manatees and brought the photographs back to me, and they had boat scars. And I said, I think I know that manatee. And she goes, I think I know you're crazy. And I go, no. So we came back, and there's a computer catalog with all the manatees now that have been identified in the state of Florida. And when they put the photograph of those manatees with the scars through that catalog, sure enough, it was a manatee that I had first photographed in Crystal River in 1979. And that manatee had been seen year after year, and then eventually showed up in Cuba. So the point is, we've learned so much more since these early days of when Hartman was here. So Crystal River and the main spring is where they used to go to primarily. That's where he did and we did most of our work. They did not go to Three Sisters. A few would go over to Magnolia Springs and those canals, but for the most part, they were out in this main part of the bay. And it's interesting because this is the main spring. You'll see that there's a building there on Banana River. There was a family that owned these islands, and they actually closed it off for a while and were charging admission for people to go swim in the main spring. But they ended up, because they owned the bottomlands but not the water rights, that got shut down pretty quickly. So that was sort of the first indicator that things were beginning to change here. And as we were learning more and more about just how unique and marvelous this place was for manatees, Hartman and myself began to feel like we needed to do something about it. Next slide. So in 1969, so this would be me with my boat with a motor on it. And we actually proposed to the county that Crystal River should become the first ever manatee sanctuary in the world. And this was a newspaper article that came out in the Tampa Tribune. And so when we proposed this to the county, basically they came back and said, no, we don't think so, kid. It will have a negative economic impact on our local economy. We don't want to do anything, you know. Well, we all kind of know where that story went. So this was the first proposal to have Crystal River made a sanctuary in 1969. Next slide. So after Hartman left, he wrote an article for National Geographic, and this was the first article for the layperson to be written about manatees. And it was called Florida Manatees, Mermaid in Peril. So when he wrote this article, it had some very nice underwater photographs and really the sort of first description of wild manatees and their natural history. And so after that was published, someone read this article. Now let's see if we can play the video, and I'll see if I can get some sound.
These are living legends, elusive, shadowy creatures that once gave substance to a myth. They are manatees, but to ancient sailors, they were the fabled mermaids of the sea. From Columbus's time to our own, no animal on Earth has been so misunderstood, so little known. The manatee holds little appeal for man. It defies conventional images of grace and beauty. It offers no promise of pleasure or profit. It is neglected and ignored. Now Captain Cousteau and his divers will seek out these forgotten mermaids in search of the reality behind the myth.
So Jacques Cousteau read that article and then sent his crew to Crystal River. So the whole crew came to Crystal River and spent 2 years here, two winter seasons. And
Young Buddy Powell of Crystal River helps them splash Sewer Sam out.
And I'll tell you the backstory in a minute.
In the cypress glades along the east coast of Florida, Philippe Cousteau heads a small expedition, which they hope will draw man's attention to the plight of an ancient animal. Once held
So that's young Buddy Powell again showing Jacques Cousteau where to go. That's Hartman in the back. So again, being a guide in Crystal River. Okay, we can. So the backstory there. So the backstory was after Cousteau read the National Geographic article, he got a hold of Hartman, and Hartman said, "Well, you got to get a hold of this kid Buddy in Crystal River. He'll take you out and show you manatees." So that's what they did, and then the following year they came back and brought Hartman and myself to be advisors And I ended up taking a year off. This was before homeschool was a big deal. I ended up taking off a year from school with the permission of my teachers. That's why I disappeared that year. That's right. And that's because I spent my time out with the Cousteaus during that season, which was absolutely fabulous. And so what we were doing there is that they had a hook for the show, which was the first release rehabilitated manatee. And that was Sewer Sam. Sewer Sam was a manatee that had gotten caught in a storm drain down in Miami. And they wanted something, some thread to go through their show, and they decided what they're going to do is bring that manatee up from Miami and release it in Crystal River, but they needed a place to film it in a sort of semi-captive place before they released it. So they brought Sewer Sam, which we'd never do something like this today, but brought Sewer Sam up, flew him up to Brooksville, trucked him from Brooksville to Crystal River, and then put him in the Three Sisters. And then fenced off the Three Sisters, where he stayed there for a couple of weeks, and where they filmed him. But when the time came to release him out in the river, he had another idea and he didn't want to go. So that's the scene there where you see all of us splashing. We were trying to encourage Sewer Sam to be released. Sewer Sam did go out. They did film him a little bit longer, and that's that final scene there where we were going out in the boat. We were actually going out and trying to find Sewer Sam. He didn't have like the satellite tags like we use today, but he had this little sonic beacon. Next slide. So the Cousteaus, this is Philippe Cousteau and this is Jacques Cousteau down in the bottom. They sort of, Philippe was here the entire time. He was the producer. He ended up sadly passing away a number of years later in a plane crash. I still stay in contact with his wife and his son. And then Jacques would show up every once in a while so they could film him. But he would come in and actually try to disguise himself. And he'd wear sunglasses, and he's got his red cap on here because they were filming him. But he would sort of circulate about, and people wouldn't even know that he was here. But it was a wonderful experience for me, and they ended up, again, being very supportive as I went off, in my career. I actually skipped my senior year of high school and got a letter of recommendation from Philippe Cousteau, because I ended up going to Stetson University, which helped me get into school. I think maybe a recommendation from Philippe Cousteau. Next slide. So coming back to Kings Bay and Crystal River, I went off to college, but I want you to see here what this place used to look like. So this photograph was taken in the bay, and we had these mats of vegetation, and it was just absolutely clear. And what people didn't realize is that these mats of hydrilla would cut the light out from the bottom. And so because there was no light on the bottom, there was nothing growing there. And it would form these cathedrals and caves that you could snorkel through and dive. And this was this beautiful cathedral of grass, and you can just get an idea of what it was like. And of course, this made for incredible habitat for manatees. So I went off to college, then went and started, it's kind of the same deal. After they passed the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the federal government started a long-term research project called the Sirenia Project, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was based in Gainesville. But again, no one really knew anything about manatees, but they were tasked with starting this research program on manatees in Florida. So they got a hold of Hartman. Hartman said, get a hold of this kid, Buddy. He's in Crystal River, which they did. And so they actually came over and visited me at Stetson, hired me as a technician. So I ended up working at Blue Springs, another place where manatees are found, and then also coming back and continuing the work that Hartman started back in the 1960s, identifying those individual manatees, keeping track of their reproduction, and their movements and so forth. So I would continue to come back to Crystal River on a regular basis while I was college. By this time I moved up to Gainesville, went to University of Florida, go Gators, and so it was very easy for me to commute down here. Next slide. So about this time, because of these mats of vegetation that were covering Kings Bay and Crystal River, you would actually, they would have harvesters to make pathways through the vegetation so boats could just get out to the river. They also started these big campaigns to try and kill the weeds. And they did that by spraying copper sulfate all through the bay. They also did acid and then also mechanically harvested it. They were successful to a large degree, but really what killed out most of the vegetation in Kings Bay back then was the series of storms, the no-name storms, and with the amount of water extraction from the springs, there was less fresh water flowing out into Crystal River. Salinity slowed, because we were recording all of this at the time, salinity was slowly increasing, and so these plants are freshwater plants and were not salt tolerant. And so they began to, well, they died off pretty much completely. Next slide. So going back to this original photograph, if you remember I showed you, this is what all of this before, and I can remember this as a kid, was all forested. There were these little creeks that ran up to springs that are located here and several other in these canals, beautiful little spring runs. And then of course the Three Sisters were here. So about 10 years later, next slide, what I just showed you turned into this. They came in, dug a big lake, and used the fill from this lake to fill in that forest. So what had gone from a beautiful, hydric hammock turned into basically a wasteland with these two little gems, or three little gems right here, which is, the Three Sisters. There were plans to develop all that, several different plans at the time. They got a permit to extract water from the springs. They were going to put townhouses in. And so this was all going to go into private development, just like the rest of those systems. Now also at this time, when I'm coming down from Gainesville and doing the manatee work, I ran into an old friend of mine, and he showed me a plat of how they were going to develop this island, that island, that island, that island, and this island, and some area over here. What they were going to do is they were going to build a causeway to Parker Island, then over to Banana Island, and then they were going to build a causeway from here over to Buzzard Island and put all of this into development. So at this time I was working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from the science side, from the research side. So we brought back the information of what was being planned for this region. So my bosses up in DC then began an initiative to purchase that land, but the service didn't have the money to purchase that land. So they partnered with not the Ocean Conservancy, but I'm having a senior moment here. Another environmental group that purchases lands. I'll think of it in a second. And so what they did is they started this big initiative, the Nature Conservancy, sorry, the Nature Conservancy. And so what they did is they sold like 1 foot plots as a fundraiser of all the bottomland in Kings Bay. And so you could purchase, and I actually have one, these little certificates of 1 foot plot to save Kings Bay, to save Crystal River. And that's how they raised the funds to then purchase all of this land. Basically now when you go out on Kings Bay, all the areas where you don't see houses, to become part of that National Wildlife Refuge. Next slide. So here we are, back in 1969. Now in the 1980s, finally this became a refuge for manatees, and one of the oppositions, by the way, to the purchase of this land for the National Wildlife Refuge was, again, this would have a negative economic impact on our community, but people come to Crystal River because of its beauty, right? And you're killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And so all those people who are fortunate enough to have waterfront property are now looking, on beautiful natural areas. And so I guess it depends on your perspective, but it's very fulfilling to me today to see that Crystal River has now become a wildlife refuge. So so this kid from Crystal River, I'll give you a little bit of just how ended up full circle back again, because I'm a resident of Crystal River now. Next slide. So after about 10 years of working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I had reached a point in my career where I needed to get a graduate degree. So I actually went out to Seattle, kind of wanted a big change, and wanted to get more involved with policy and wildlife management. So I ended up getting my master's degree at University of Washington. And while I was out there, again, kind of same story, there's 3 species of manatees. There's the West Indian manatee, and the one we have here is a subspecies called the Florida manatee. There's one in the Amazon, and then there's one in Africa. But the one in Africa had never really been studied before. And so I was offered a contract. And in this case, they got a hold of Fish and Wildlife Service and said, we need someone to work on manatees in Africa. And they said, get a hold of this young man, Buddy, who's in college, and maybe he can do that for you. So that's what happened, is I went to Africa to do a study of manatees on the Gambia River. And with that data and with that information, I came back and wrote a grant to go back to Africa to be the first to study African manatees in depth. So I moved to Ivory Coast, which is on the west coast of Africa, and lived in some waterfront property here for 3 years, and started a project on manatees in Africa. And so manatees in Africa are still hunted. And so it's very difficult for us to find manatees because they're very cryptic and very shy. But finally, working with some Nigerian manatee fishermen, aka manatee hunters, how they catch them in places in Africa. And sometime you'll have to come to another talk, because I talk a lot about manatees. I'm just touching on it now, but they would catch them in these nets that have very large mesh. So those of you that are familiar with a gill net, it's very much like a gill net, where the manatee would swim through, but it can't quite get through. And then when it tries to back up, its flippers get entangled in the net, and it doesn't have any lead on the bottom, or not, very little leaded. So the manatee is basically just trapped there and can't move. So it took me about a year, with the help of some of these fishermen, to catch the first manatee, which we were able to tag. So this tagged manatee, I was able to track from my hut. This was on a river, and there was a lagoon next door, and this is actually me tagging one of those African manatees, and this is when we were releasing it. So this manatee would make like a 2-week circuit. It would go over to this other lagoon, and then it would come back again, and it would sort of hang out in the river close to where we first caught it. And so one time I'd been out all night tracking it because they're hunted. They would tend to travel just during the night, and then they would rest during the day. So it didn't show up like it usually would in its typical circuit. And so I had to go into Abidjan to get a visa or something, came back some days later and backtracked. And when I backtracked, I picked up the signal of the manatee, but not across the lagoon, but from a village that was right there. And so when I got out of the boat with my antenna, which is what allowed me to track the beacon, and all these people began coming out of the huts. I went and visited the chief and asked the folks there, do you know anything about manatees? And they go, well, anything about manatees that have this floating tag on it? Nope, don't know anything at all. So finally we walked around, and we got to this fisherman's hut, and this guy is mending his net, and asked him about about manatees and whether they had a tag on it or not. And he goes, no, I don't know anything about it, So I went in the hut, and it's like, this smells like beef. This is a fishing village where there's no beef. And so we, again, asked the questions. And finally, I found a little piece of the manatee belt there, sadly, and asked them, do you know anything about this? No, we don't know anything about this. So I'm picking up the signal. And so I went out behind the hut, and we picked up the signal from the ground. And so we dug down with our machetes, and my assistant is there. And by now there's this big crowd around us. And finally we find the tag that had been chopped up into pieces. But the center of it is made out of stainless steel, and it's like, Dracula. They couldn't kill the beacon. And so everyone's now kind of standing back, couldn't quite figure out how I was able to find this thing, and we're asking the crowd, do you know anything about this? And my assistant says, okay, let's go. I go, what do you mean let's go? He goes, let's go. I'm going to stay behind. So we left, we went off, went to where we were staying, reported it to the wildlife authorities, and we came back the next morning. And when we came back the next morning, it was like the whole village is out on the beach waiting for us. And when we got there, they go, he did it. He's the guy that did it. And I go, and that's weird. But we take him, and what my assistant told me is that what he had been telling them in the local dialect, because they believed very much in magic there and superstition, and they said, oh man, my boss, he is so angry. I have never seen him so angry. And you see what strong magic he has. I'm glad I don't live in this village because I don't want to be here tomorrow when he comes back. And so they said, give this guy to, me. And so we went back, we interviewed him, and as it turns out, he was a manatee hunter. So as the story goes on, and I'm making it as short as I can, it turns out it's special people in the village who are these manatee hunters. And they have a special ranking within the village. They share the meat amongst the village. And he helped me then tag a number of manatees. But the other thing about it is we went through this whole local community court. So manatees in Africa are protected by government law, but they're also protected by traditional law, cultural law. And so by tradition, one of the ways that they dispatch a manatee is they harpoon it, and then that harpoon is attached to a float, and that manatee with that float belongs to that particular hunter. So my tagged manatee belonged to me. He had no right to touch that manatee. And so we put him through this court, And so the community, the chief and that regional chief all agreed that he had no right to do this, and he was fined a case of beer and a goat. But the important thing about it is I hired him. And he then became my guide, and his son ended up working for my African assistant, who then went on to continue the work. And that whole region became a sanctuary, a manatee sanctuary and a ram site. And so with the unfortunate death of that one individual, we probably protected many, many more manatees in the future. Next slide. So I ended up spending about 10 years in Africa, and from Ivory Coast, moved to Cameroon, where we continued that manatee work, but then I was also joined by a volunteer who is in the back of the room here, who eventually became my wife. And so she and I worked together in Africa and have worked in partnership. I was more interested in the wildlife. She was more interested in the community development and working with the people. And so we made a really, really good team. So this is my wife and I fording a river in Africa. This is a Liana bridge. I mean, this wasn't for tourists. This is how, during the rainy season, people go down the village trails to get from one village to another. And we lived, at that time, a 2-day walk into the forest to our field camp and our field station that Maureen actually designed and built with trees that were right there, and I couldn't have done the work without her. So I ended up working on my PhD from Cambridge University, and my professor was an elephant guy. Now, those of you that know much about manatees and elephants share a common ancestor. And that common ancestor was somewhat like a hippo, but not related at all, sort of a semi-aquatic animal. And so this area where we were working in Cameroon had had forest elephants. This is at that time, it wasn't considered a separate species, but now we know it's a separate species. And so my professor was an elephant guy from East Africa, and he said, "Buddy, guess what? We don't know anything about forest elephants. Why don't you switch your PhD to work on elephants?" And so I did. And so ended up working on forest elephants. And this was actually one of the first forest elephants that had ever been satellite tagged. And what we learned is that they play a very important role as dispersing seeds in the rainforest. And so I now have a student that's continuing the work in Africa. And as well, her name is Lucy Keith, her work has resulted in many more people being trained besides the people I trained while I was there. And a number of sanctuaries are now going into place in Africa, particularly for manatees. Elephants, we have lots of stories that maybe over margarita, I'll tell you later, about getting chased up trees. Maureen will attest to this. Manatees are much gentler than elephants, so I was very glad to go back to them. So let's go, next slide. So from Africa, we, being Maureen and myself, we were offered a job. At this time, when we were in Africa, we were working for the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Bronx Zoo, the international part of the Bronx Zoo. So we were offered a job WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, had built a field station on an island in a coral atoll 60 miles off the coast of Belize, and they asked us if we would like to go manage and get this station up and running. And it was like, oh, this is suburbia compared to where we were in Africa, because in Africa we didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water, we had to walk 2 days to get out to our field station when we first arrived. This is a boat ride, and we had solar panels and a wind generator, and we had electricity, and we had a radio. that we could communicate with. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was beautiful. So we moved to Belize for 3 years. And again, Maureen, being the wonderful manager and carpenter that she is, helped to build that station. And while we were there, the government was interested in starting a manatee research and conservation project in Belize. And same story, they got a hold of someone, they said, oh, you need to get a hold of this guy, Buddy. By the way, he lives in Belize now. And so in the 1990s, we started a research project in Belize called a longitudinal study. Most everything we know about manatees is from Florida, but manatees are primarily a tropical animal. That's the reason they have to come into springs to stay warm during the wintertime. But most of their range is where it's warm. But we didn't know anything about manatees in what is really their most typical habitat, where they don't have to contend with cold weather, isolated, they didn't have to contend with human activities, construction and boats and so forth. So we wanted to get an idea of what do manatees do when they don't have all these disturbances and issues. And so that was the point of the study. And also, here in Florida, we've had to be reactive for boat speeds and sanctuaries and so forth. There, they could be proactive. They could set up sanctuaries and speed limits where people didn't really care yet. And so that's how our data has been and was being used in Belize. While we were down there, we happened to have a child, and that child is here now, and 26 years old. And to tell you an interesting story, when we first tagged our first manatees there was it was a mother, and the second group was a mother and calf. So we named those 2 manatees after my wife Maureen and my daughter Morgan. And so we go down every year to do health assessments like they do here in Crystal River, and to tag manatees. So periodically we would pick up Morgan, the same age as my daughter, because as you can see in this picture, she would come down most every year. And we had a film crew there, and we picked up Morgan the manatee, and Morgan the human was there too. And so the film crew go, oh, this is a great little story here. So they ended up interviewing Morgan for the story, and it made a nice little subpart. So we go down every year. It's a training session for international biologists to come and work in a place probably more typical where they are from. And people from Africa and Colombia and Jamaica and Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico have all come to participate in our program and to get trained. This is like a typical time with our international crew there, also Belizeans, of course. And this is one of the animals that we had picked up. We actually just got back from Belize a few weeks ago. We had to go on hiatus for COVID, but one of the animals that we picked up this time was the first time we had caught it was 23 years ago. And so we've continued to pick up this animal a few times since then. So it's giving us really important data in terms of reproduction, growth rates that we knew nothing about before. Also, we picked up an animal that had been entangled in fishing gear in both of its flippers. And we had a veterinarian there who was able to go in and do minor surgery right there on the deck of the boat because we don't have a good rescue rehab facility in Belize. And so was able to get rid of most of that fishing line that would have cut through those flippers. But now what we're seeing, when we first arrived there and we would be doing health assessments on manatees, they would be absolutely clean, just beautiful. Now we're picking up animals that are scarred by boats, and the mortality related to watercraft injury is increasing. We estimate there's about 1,000 manatees in Belize, but also their habitat, just like here in Florida, is being impacted. There are areas where it's being developed very rapidly. Dredge and fill, just like Florida is going on, increasing boat traffic, increasing tourism. Cruise ships are coming in, and this very area where we worked called Southern Lagoon, which is right here, that's our primary study area. There's a cruise ship terminal going in down in Placencia, down here, all of that area. When we first started working there, there was hardly just anything there, and now there's a cruise ship terminal. So we're seeing the same path in Belize as we've seen in Florida, but fortunately we have been able to get speed zones in place in many areas. We have this long-term data that the government is using, and the government working with our individuals, someone named Jamal that some of you might have seen on social media. Oh, sorry, right here, this guy. He first came to, when we would go down every year, he came out to the dock one time, and he was like this little scrawny kid. And he wanted to go out with us, but he was too small. And we came back, the next year, and he had gone from this big to this big. And so he ended up going out with us on the boat. This young boy at that time, he was about 14, was just absolutely passionate about manatees. And he ended up going out with us, volunteering with us. And he came from this very remote village, particularly his grandparents. And, and so he really, in that whole community, would have very few possibilities. There was a lot of drugs and so forth. But his passion for manatee helped give him direction in life, and we sort of recognized that. He never would have finished high school, but if he wanted to continue working with us, we told him, you have to finish high school. So he continued volunteering. We helped him through high school, and then it came time for him to go to college. And we said, you can't keep working with us unless you go to college. So we ended up going to college there in Belize. We ended up giving him a job as an assistant, and I'm very happy to report that he's about to get his master's degree at UC Santa Cruz. It's just remarkable. So he's been very, very pivotal in Belize. His life is a little bit similar to my own, where he had a mentor to help make a difference in his life. And so he is, along with partners and Clearwater Marine Aquarium, are building a rehab facility, and the government of Belize is kicking in $750,000 to build this manatee rescue and rehab facility in Gales Point, that little village where we hope to hire local people and provide employment besides trying to save and help manatees right there. And that's a really big deal for a government where, and also through donations, they don't get tax deductions, to have skin in the game and invest in something like this. And that manatees are so beloved there that they're willing to do that. Just like Florida, manatees now have become an iconic species in Belize. Next slide. So full circle, we moved back to Florida in the late 1990s. I worked for Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, managing their manatee and sea turtle and right whale program. And then ended up creating a nonprofit that's recently merged a few years ago with the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, the town where I was born. And now I am responsible for everything that's animal related, animal health, veterinary care, and also all of our research and conservation outside our walls. Next slide. And that includes work on the endangered right whales, sea turtles. Of course, we have many manatee projects going on, not only here in the US, but also in Belize, Cuba, Dominican Republic. This is actually me down in tagging a manatee in the Dominican Republic. Sea turtle nesting. And so it's grown into a very widespread global research and conservation facility, besides our roots at Clearwater Marine Aquarium, which is rescue, rehab, and release. And we just broke ground last week on the construction of a rehab facility for manatees at Clearwater Marine Aquarium. We had been doing it for dolphin and sea turtles for many years, but we've now moved into doing it for manatees. So, full circle, when I went off to college, my dad called me up because they had gotten involved with playing golf, and the house had flooded a few times. They said, buddy, do you mind if we move to Seven Rivers Golf Course, which is now defunct? And I said, I don't care, Dad, sure, whatever, I'm in college. So they bought a house out there, and so we are now moved to that house, because we, however many years later, so now a resident of Crystal River and very happy to be back. And that's my story.